Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and today's video will heavily feature this Kickstarter by Wargame3D, but I'll mention them more later on because these are the stls that they have sent over for me to have a look at. Specifically, this is the Cromwell 4 A27M, natively scaled for 28mm wargames such as bolt action. The model is split in a number of different ways, which I find quite interesting, as it gives you the opportunity to print the parts separately and in different ways to get the best out of your print quality. As these models are catered for both SLA and FDM printing, that's really handy. The first, spinning happily here, is the complete or monolithic version, the entire Cromwell in one part. There's also the complete hull, turret and cannon, so you can still have a simple print with the turret movable. And the next, I think, is the better advantage for most people's printing, and that's the hull separated from the tracks. Generally, I find the tank hulls will print better upright or angled pointing upwards, where the tracks will almost always print better with the wheel details pointing up, so kind of on their side. So having these parts separate means that you can get the most out of these prints. But there is one more option. The one I've just been showing has a solid backing for the tracks and road wheels, and this makes it more easy to print, everything joined into a single block. But this new alternative that was unlocked during the Kickstarter, and that is the tracks without the backing block. And these may be harder to print, you need to be more careful with supports depending on your printer, but they end up looking way nicer and more realistic. And those are what I'll be printing up today. Or rather, I would be printing if my printer worked. Unfortunately, I've had no end of issues recently with my aged resin printer. Secondhand, multiple replacement parts, it's basically a goner at this point. And so I want to give a big thank you to Ratman, my good friend, who let me borrow his printer to get the Cromwell parts printed out to show you today. And while that runs, I'll show off some of the details of the Cromwell to show off how Wargame3D have handled making some of those fine details for both FDM and SLA printing. Now, of course, you can just send any STL file to either type of printer and they'll have a good go at giving you something. But more generally, resin printers are capable of the finer details, and filament is more capable at making flexible thin parts that won't shatter like resin does. So what Wargame3D have done is they've made the details ever so slightly chunkier, more exaggerated, in a similar way to how hero scale figures have exaggerated features and details. And this actually has the side effect of being slightly hero scale, sort of, for a vehicle, and so the details are more prominent, easier to print, easier to paint, and easier to see when they're on the tabletop, and that means that your model is just going to look that much cooler. I'll show off one example of that, the protection bars for the headlights, which are nice and chunky so they'll print out fine, but also look good and paint up nicely. They also have this thin sheet, almost of support underneath, and that'll help them print out of either system. But I wonder if in a resin print that can be cut out easily. That is something I will have to check. Bear in mind the advances in both technologies make the difference between FDM and SLA much less of an issue. A modern printer of either type will give you a nice little tank. With these files. Speaking of modern printers, Ratman's Elegoo Mars Pro 2 has finished kicking out the model pieces, so let's get to work building and painting. The parts have come out very nicely, as you might expect from a printer with 50nm pixel density. There's a little bit of warping, but that's more to do with print settings than the files themselves. One thing I noted is that the fitment of the parts is extremely tight, and I had to sand every connection point to make it fit. The turret needed a little extra sanding so that it turned smoothly, and the main gun block, the trunnion I guess, had to be sanded just a little bit to make that fit. Gluing the tracks on was no issue. Although the no backing version of the tracks has no keying like the backed version does, I easily managed to line up the track guard shape with the hull geometry and it all went together nicely. There's also the stowage bins, I think, and you can pop a spot of glue in there and press upwards on the track and that'll hold in place nicely. Now, those guard bars for the headlights. I said I'd try to cut out the support panel, and the first one went poorly. I did find the parts and glued them back into place, and for the other side I was a little more careful. Instead of trying to cut my way through it, I scribed around the edge and the panel popped out fairly nicely. It's not perfect, and I think I'd rather prefer to not have this panel and use conventional supports instead. I also, for the sake of fun, ran the same files out in native scale on my aged CR10. As Wargame3D have made these files for FDM and resin, well, I might at least try to put it out on my FDM machine. The quality at 0.2mm layer height is obviously nothing that a resin printer would even put out on a bad day. The entire model did, however, print out correctly, and only the turret lamp snapped off when I pulled it off the bed. I mention this specifically to say that if you have a FDM machine that you've dialed in for model making, you can certainly get better quality than mine, particularly with less stringing, that sort of thing. You'll end up with a pretty decent looking tank model that'll paint up nicely. But for this video, I'm only going to paint the resin printed version, and not that I'm going to spend an awful long time on it, so let's get a quick paint job out of the way. And the quickest way to get some base coats on is with an airbrush, and you then spend half an hour cleaning it out and clearing clogs, so it's actually slower than with a bristle brush, but let's give it a go anyway. I gave it a little medium brown from below all around the tracks, and the hull as a little bit of shading for a sand colour that I filled out the entire vehicle with. I then found out that my dark brown is a little far gone for my airbrush, so I used some of the medium brown for the camo pattern instead. Just some fairly random splotches around the hull and the turret, followed swiftly by dark green in the same random patchy way. Whilst I did have a plan and a vague recollection of an early war camo pattern, what I ended up painting here doesn't really match it. It does, however, look good enough for me, so let's carry on with some detail work. And why not go straight into some freehanding? I've seen several British tanks, including Cromwell's with a yellow circle on the turret, and my yellow looks pretty good over a pink underlayer, so I'll do it that way. There's also a bridging weight and unit marking on the front. There's a very vague rendering here of a desert rat. It's not great, but I really hate decals, and so I will suffer this. The headlights and turret lamp got a base coat of grey, lower edge highlight with some teal, and then some white spots, a classic, simple, old school style. I wanted to add a little bit of weathering and overall darkening to the model, but without relying on washes. And so for this I used a light all over dry brush of dark brown. I nearly went with black for this, but I thought that might be a little stark. Black, however, was suitable for the tracks and the road wheels, as well as a few minor details around the model. Most of these would end up having metallic silver over the top, as it generally looks better with a black undercoat. But I did also edge highlight a lot of the model, particularly where the brown dry brush was a little heavy. So whilst I don't want to do an all over wash, I do want to use my ink wash as a stand-in for a pin wash. And I've been trying a new technique for that using two brushes. The first to wipe some clean water over the area, and the second to spot in some of the wash. And this usually focuses the pigments in the recesses, but allows some of it to seep out, giving a little bit of a gradient. And while it is quite glossy, a little bit of matte varnish over the top will fix that. And with that, my basic paint job is done. I do certainly want to come back with some more detail and some more weathering to really bring this tank out, which just goes to show the potential of these models. You can spend lots of time with weathering and detail to paint it really nicely. But there's one other point of potential. As the detail is quite chunky, sort of hero scale for vehicles as I mentioned earlier, you can shrink the models down to a smaller scale and they'll still come out well. I thought I'd give that a go and see just how small it could be. This is a 1:100 scale, scaled by 56% of the original version. As there are several games in this scale, I thought this would be handy. This, however, is a 1:285 scale, utterly tiny, 20% the size of the original. This tiny one does have a few failure points. Some of the parts are so thin they couldn't survive the printing process. However, this might actually be due to my resin printer cracking a screen, and that is of course why I needed Ratman to print off the main one for the video today. Just how small you can go depends on your print quality. Just before I give my overall opinion, I will acknowledge my biases. Firstly, Wargame3D did send me the STLs for this model, and some others as well, in exchange for posting about it. They made no attempt or mention of saying anything particular, and so my opinions are my own, and no money changed hands. The Cromwell is a good looking British tank, and I did want a British built tank to go alongside my American Shermans. I also think that 3D printing in general is a massive faff and loads of effort, but it is often worth the models that you get out of it. And this is mainly because my printers are aged and I should probably just buy a new, better printer to improve my entire experience. Thanks again to Ratman for the use of a much nicer printer today. Looking at the Kickstarter, the STL pack for the British is €36 for 13 vehicles. Including the variations in track and hatch that get unlocked during the Kickstarter, €3 each is not a bad price for the amount of effort that goes into 3D modelling, both recreating a historical vehicle but also aligning them with the detail method that Wargame3D wanted. There's no way to pick up only one or a few different vehicles, so it's a big bundle or nothing, unfortunately. For the other negative points, there's also that very tight fit on some of the parts and the odd support on this particular model's headlight. Those aren't big issues, they're just something that I'd mention. For anyone playing bolt action with a 3D printer or access to one, I do think these are a good buy. You might not print all 13 options, but you'll get several tanks and several armoured cars, plus the ubiquitous universal carrier. Where I think this really shines is for Flames of War player or other 1:100 scale players, where you're likely going to print several of each vehicle and probably a wider variety of vehicles as well. On top of that, there are the previous Kickstarters from Wargame3D for German and Italian forces of World War II, and I'm keeping my eyes peeled for the other factions in the future. If you would like to take a closer look, please check the link in the description where you can have a better view of what's included, and if you do, tell them I sent you. For now, I have a whole bunch of tiny Cromwells that I need to find space for, but I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.